Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to this panel on the challenges and opportunities for science for policy in crises. My name's Toby. I am the head of communications for the scientific advice mechanism to the European Commission. And we have a quartet of stellar policy advisors up, I was going to say on the stage, but here on the carpet with me. Starting on... Ooh, that was for you, Tina. Starting on my right, your left, is Professor Tina Chalmers, who is at the Delft Technical University?
University of Technology.
Thank you. Tina's an expert in crisis management, and she was formerly, and I suppose continues to be, the chair of the SAPEA working group on crisis management in the European Union, SAPEA being the organisation that informed the scientific advice given by the group of chief scientific advisors to the College of European Commissioners on crisis management. Next down the line is Barbara Prainsack. She's a professor of political science at the University of Vienna. And despite insisting to me in the past that she's not an ethicist, she is nonetheless the chair of the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies, kind of the sister organisation to the Group of Chief Scientific Advisors, also advising the European Commission. In fact, in your case, the President of the European Commission, I believe. Third along the line is Maarja Kruusmaa. She is a computer scientist and professor and vice rector for research at Tallinn University of Technology, and she is a member of the aforementioned group of chief scientific advisors. And finally, at the end of the line, Daniela Bucci, who is a geologist for the Italian government in the Department of Civil Protection. So we're going to take the speakers just to say hello and a few words on this topic in the order I introduce them, and they're seated and not, therefore, in the order in which they appear on the screen. Speakers, questions to you will come from three directions. They will come from the audience here in the room. Perhaps they will come from the online audience, which we can see here on this screen, and I will read out. You don't need to worry about it, I will read them out. And perhaps also from each other. It would be nice to have a lively discussion, which is my kind of polite way of saying if you disagree with each other a bit, that would be quite fun. I'm going to ask the first question and then hopefully just butt out. So you've all had experience of advising policymakers during crises, and I think we're leaving what exactly counts as a crisis a bit vague deliberately. Let's take our intuitive understanding for now, and then perhaps if the boundaries are a bit fuzzy, you might want to sharpen them up at some point during the discussion. But we know in any case, crisis situations bring particular challenges for everyone, for policymakers, for citizens living their lives. But the premise of our discussion is that they also bring particular challenges and perhaps also opportunities for scientific advice and ethics advice to policymakers, since those two are so closely intertwined. So my question for each of you, and starting with Tina, what are the ways in which crisis situations provide particular challenges for policymakers, and also are there any ways in which they provide opportunities or lessons we can learn? Tina.
Yeah. Thanks for having us here, and also thanks to the audience for sort of finding it after we try to maximize confusion. I'm very, very happy to be here. And indeed, we are living in challenging times. I mean, you only have, I assume you all have watched the news over the past days. There is, and there has been, I think, over the last year or years, not a single day without being confronted with crises. Crises of various natures, right? We see wars in Europe and at our borders. We have had, again in summer, climate extremes, heat waves, floods. We had devastating earthquakes, to which also the civil protection mechanism responded. We are still confronted with massive inflation, economic decline, and so forth. Now, really the challenge, and I think that's both for policy and for science, is that all of this is connected. And that means for us, being scientists, that we really have to make, in the morning there were these pleas in the plenary also for interdisciplinary research, that we have to take that up and think through the consequences of these crises. COVID was again mentioned a lot this morning, and of course we've seen that COVID was not just a health crisis, but also affected really the lives, livelihoods, education, well-being and welfare of many, many people. So we need to tackle this in an interdisciplinary way. Another challenge, I think, is that we are often reacting to crisis. Although, and maybe that's confirmed by civil protection later on, what you normally try in crisis management is to be ahead of the crisis. So other than just responding to something and always sort of running after the fact, you try to be ahead of it. And that really requires a change of perspective, right? That you have to ask yourself what not only will very likely happen, but also what might happen, and what should we be prepared for? What do we want to be prepared for? What can we be prepared for? And sometimes that also touches upon inconvenient things, questions that are potentially highly politicized, right? Toby mentioned that we had the discussion of the evidence review report. When we started this report, that was meant as a sequel of the COVID-19 reports. But then, of course, you know, when we had assembled the working group, we were also asking what expertise do we need, and we were sticking to a scoping paper. But then, of course, the war in Ukraine started, and there were all of a sudden huge questions about migration. And I've been working on crisis and humanitarian disaster management throughout my career, and I know that issues like migration are highly value-laden. I think that's a nice segue to you, but very often uncomfortable. So difficult for politics to discuss. And I think there we also have to think about how do we make these potential crises or these ongoing crises that are there, how can we also dare discuss these crises that we maybe don't want to see? And related to that is also like a question we had is like what very often in COVID, when is this going to start? And at some point we heard a policymaker say, well, COVID is over when the next crisis starts. And that may be a reflex of the political system. But again, it doesn't speak to the nature of these entangled crises that we are confronted with, whereby climate change, migration, conflict are all interrelated. So again, this is something where we need to dare look also at the tools that science has to address this complexity.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question, because you point out, you emphasize, and also in the evidence review report, you emphasize very clearly that the crises are all interrelated, that they're entangled with one another and they kind of feed each other. Do you also get the sense that they have like basically the same or similar underlying causes? Are they also connected in that way, that these crises come from the same root causes?
So it's always hard to identify one single root cause for any crisis, but of course there are some underlying trends that amplify things. Now, when we talk about the technicalities of what a crisis is, so a crisis occurs when there is a hazard, an extreme event, for instance, like an earthquake or a flood. And of course, these are amplified by climate change, amplifies these extreme weather events. But they're also always only, so a hazard becomes a crisis or a disaster if it meets a societal vulnerability. Right? And there, of course, we are looking at systems where more and more people live in areas that are prone to climate change. We see increasingly complex systems that are highly entangled, that amplify these vulnerabilities. We see poverty, right? It's also eroding coping capacity, a lack of trust that was also mentioned, and all these make then, or turn, the impact of a hazard into increasingly severe and serious crises that ripple then throughout.
Great, thank you. And thanks also for introducing some of those useful distinctions between the crisis and the hazard and the vulnerability. Great, thank you. Barbara, the same question to you. What are the opportunities and what are the challenges?
So thank you also from my side to everyone who made it in person and online. I think Tina's introduction was really good. Also because you drew attention to a lot of the controversies and a lot of the policy issues actually being issues about value and values. Very few policy problems, as policymakers will know, can be solved on the basis of information alone. And that's a kind of ironic situation that we have seen in scientific policy advice during the COVID crisis, but also before. So very often, and I speak also as the chair of the European Group on Ethics, those who are seen as in charge of the soft stuff, quote unquote, are those who are seen as in charge of the ethics and experts on value, which, by the way, is not just thinking out loud about what you think is good, but there's a lot of empirical evidence on what creates trust, what hurts trust. All of this type of expertise was very often marginalized. And the narrative was, well, there's an acute crisis and there's no time to think about values. So the effect of that was exactly what we heard downstairs in the first panel, namely that there's a huge crisis of trust, there's a crisis of trust in science, there's a crisis of trust actually not so much in democracy, but in governing. And the expertise of that, I think, really needs to be foregrounded in policy advising, especially also when it comes to the multi-crises, the poly-crisis, as some call it, the nested crisis, that include, of course, very prominently the climate crisis. The climate crisis can be described, or policymaking in the context of the climate crisis can be described as controversies about values. It's not really a controversy about evidence, I dare say. So how can we do that? I think policymakers really need to stop solving value crisis by looking at opinion polls. Not only because they can't solve it in this way, but also because it is actually, from a democratic point of view, very, very problematic. Democracy is not majority rule. So I'm a political scientist by training, but also the European Group on Ethics has published our opinion on democracy in the digital age recently, where we emphasize the point that democracy becomes an empty shell if it's reduced to the outer institutions, such as elections, as important as they are. But democracy is not just a majority rule. Democracy includes the protection of minorities. And just to solve value crises by looking at, and I'm talking also about my own country, I'm not necessarily talking about the EU level, I'm talking about many national policymakers. To use a COVID example, they look at what is the percentage of people who are willing to wear masks, who doesn't like them, so we do away with the mask mandate, and so on. So this is not a way to solve. I would even say this is the beginning of an undemocratic way of problem solving. So we need to have more systematic ways of bringing in expertise on value, and I don't mean only public deliberation. I don't mean only broadening the scope of people who have a say, as important as that is. I'm talking about the bringing in of systematic evidence of ethical concerns, systematic ethical considerations of aspects, and empirical evidence on value and values. And Toby asked this question about the common root cause, or the root cause of many of those crises, and one could describe it, paraphrasing Mazzucato, as a crisis of value. So our societies, our political and economic institutions are chasing and embedding the wrong values, one could say. This is not something radically new. There are lots of people who are making this very argument right now. Two more points that I just want to put on the agenda. I'm not going to elaborate on them because I've spoken for 4 minutes and 50 seconds. So short-term thinking, and this I do criticize policymakers for what I mentioned, solving value crisis by opinion polls, but I don't criticize them for short-term thinking. I think this is built into our current electoral cycles, into our political institutions, if you will. But we need to get over it. We need to collectively find a way to increase the choice architecture, to change the choice architecture, to increase incentives for policymakers to think long term. Helga Novotny calls it cathedral thinking. So we need to get policymakers to make decisions now that they won't live to see. They won't live to see the effects, and still they need to. It needs to be possible for them to do that, especially around climate change, where there's a very lively debate, as you know, on how to represent the needs of future generations. And the last point that I'll make, because Toby kindly allowed me to speak for 1 more minute, Tina already put it very well. What's a crisis versus an emergency or a vulnerability? I want to draw our attention also to the fact that crises are what changes the status quo, and it says a lot about us, what we call a crisis and what we don't. And the problem with policy making and policy advice is also sometimes we're asking the very same policymakers with the same toolbox to solve the crisis that was created by the same toolbox. This is not something that policymakers can change or that we can change. But for example, when we give advice to a government that has really flown the flags of austerity, and then they suddenly embrace resilience. Resilience includes redundancy, it includes buffers. It means that you have more staff in a hospital than you actually need. So you need to pay them well, you need to give them. So there's a value conflict here. We won't be able to save crisis with the same policy instruments that we use to bring about the crisis.
Thank you very much. No, don't put it down because I want to ask you a question. A quick one.
I've already spoken for 7 minutes now.
Well, but when it's so interesting, why not continue a little longer? So you say that you kind of don't blame a policymaker for the short-term thinking because it's built into the system in which they work, and I can understand that. But you do blame them for being too sensitive to opinion polls and the changing public opinion. Why make that distinction? Because isn't that also like built into the environment in which they work?
Well, because, okay, I have to go into political theory a little bit by answering this. At the moment, our theories of representation are limited to representing human beings that are alive now. There are many people who think that should be changed. There are people who say that we need to find ways to represent non-human entities and future generations, and there are very interesting approaches going back to Hannah Pitkin, how to do that. But this is the current state. We're supposed to represent the interests of people being alive now. However, when it comes to looking at the evidence to create value, to solve value conflicts, the evidence are not opinion polls, and to just use opinion polls is lazy and unexcusable from a democratic point of view, because exactly for the reason that I mentioned, it becomes a reduction to, you reduce democracy to a very crude understanding of what the majority view is, and in countries that has monopolized media and censorship, it means that you're more or less enforcing and entrenching the rules of those who control the media.
Fascinating, thank you. Thank you, Maarja and Daniela, for your patience, but I think this is good stuff. Maarja, the same questions to you, which I won't repeat again.
Yeah, thank you very much. Interesting opinions, and already much has been said. I would bring out two aspects that previous speakers didn't touch upon that much. And one is as a question of uncertainty for a scientific advisor. So we know it's almost a definition of a crisis. Tina can correct me, but if a crisis strikes, we actually don't know what's happening. There is a lot of uncertainty. And that makes science advice in crisis much more challenging than in other cases, because we don't know really what kind of virus is that, or who is attacking, or something like that. We have to go and collect evidence, and we have to do it fast. And at the same time, the decision makers can't wait. They have to act upon not knowing. So for a science advisor, it's very important that we don't communicate only the facts that we know, the evidence that we know, but also the uncertainty that comes along with that. So there's a big difference if we say that the virus is deadly, or the virus maybe is deadly, or we think the virus might be deadly, because for a policymakers who listens to that, she can take a completely different decision based on how much there is uncertainty. in that. And it's very hard thing for a science advisor to go out there and say, I don't know. But in some cases, we have to honestly say that, there's nothing to say. We just don't know. We just act on your gut feeling, on your, experienced politicians have a very good gut feeling sometimes. They know what to do even without a scientific advice. And to know your limitation is quite difficult in those cases. And Barbara already spoke about values in crisis and the definition of crisis. It's value-laden by definition. But something we don't talk so much about is that science advisors also have values. And therefore, science advisors also have biases. And now it depends on the crisis. Sometimes, these biases are really strong and sometimes they are not. I think they are much smaller with the COVID. Everybody knows with the COVID is an enemy. We have to kill it. It wasn't so sure with the Ukrainian war. We all thought the same thing. Well, it's okay, still go trade and, keep some money in the bank and so on, whatever. So the values are sometimes, we think a lot about biases. This is why also we have 7 chief scientific advisors for different fields from different countries with different experiments. So, the bias is kind of, even out. But still, we all relatively well paid in our 50s, mostly liberal academics, white, and so on. So we definitely have some sort of a bias, and at the same time we are giving advice to policymakers who have to make the decisions for completely different kind of audience than we are. And knowing our limitations in cases is quite important.
Do you know of any useful mechanisms or techniques, like very practically speaking, that you as a science advisor can use to try to, if you're aware of those biases, to try and reduce their effect? You mentioned one of just having more of you, right, from more different backgrounds. Any more tips?
I found it very useful to work with the European group of ethics for exactly that reason, that we can tell apart what is an evidence-based and what is a value-based decision. And they go hand in hand in crisis. But to make sure that what is really an evidence and what I think or what I wish would be an evidence, or what I would disregard as an evidence, that's very useful. To know that you're actually a value-based creature already helps to reduce that bias drastically.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Daniela, so from your experience of advising on crises in Italy, what can you bring to the discussion?
Thank you. My first point is a little bit to introduce you in how civil protection in Italy works, because we are part of the Prime Minister's office. So we are a technical structure that is coordinated by the Prime Minister and coordinates a system. So civil protection means the different level of government, so national, regional, and so on, means scientists that are formally part of the system, means professionals, means students, and so on. So the system is complex, includes the science, and this is the first point I would like to underline. One of the most important results that we achieved since the 70s is work together with a scientific community. They support us in all the risk cycle. This is a second point. They don't jump in during a crisis. Scientific community is with us every day. We collaborate every day with them. They provide us, of course, STEM disciplines are the first one. They monitor earthquakes, they monitor volcanoes. We are addressing this issue in this period. They provide us support in the legislation, but they are formally with us because the scientific community is in the law that rules civil protection in Italy. The second point is that we work on the entire risk cycle. So prevention, forecasting, preparedness, And then a response to, in case of emergency, and or what after the emergency is needed. So working together in these fields, there is a continuous preparation, and no one jumps in. How can I say? There is no scientific advice to the policymakers. There are scientists and policymakers that work together. This is the different paradigm that I would like to underline. The third point is that when we talk about risk cycle, we talk about, for instance, all the components of the risk. So we have scientists that help us in the physical phenomena, floods. We have scientists that help us in an assessment of the vulnerability, that is the physical vulnerability of buildings, for instance, but also the social vulnerability, the involvement of the vulnerable groups, both in prevention and during the emergency, and means the exposure, so the large numbers of people and of goods that are exposed to the events. In these years, we are also addressing the involvement of economics and social sciences, following the discussion this morning on the panel, at the introductory panel, because the indirect effects of crises and emergencies are really important, and they have to be balanced, evaluating the costs of prevention, because of course we know that prevention is much less expensive, but we know that politicians are not particularly interested in investing in prevention. And another point that I would like to underline is that we should differentiate. In the world of policymakers, there are two main groups of There are the politicians and the technical policymakers, because as civil protection officials, we are as well policymakers, but we do not decide about the policies. We decide the technical policies, but not the politics. So there are different roles and different responsibilities. And in fact, the system works well when we know the responsibilities of each other and we do not fail these responsibilities. So for instance, let me say, which is the acceptable level of risk is in charge of the politics. Of course, because it includes values. What's acceptable for me is not acceptable for another country. And this is a topic not always addressed happily by politicians. And when to intervene in case of emergency is up to us, but we need to decide based on scientific contribution. Very often scientists do not provide quantitative advice, so it's quite difficult for us to decide without quantitative evaluations. One of the solutions that is working quite well in Italy that could be something that could be discussed is that in our system we have some, we call them hybrid experts. I am a typical hybrid expert because I am a governmental officer, but I have also an habilitation as full professor in structural geology. I am a geologist. So I am exactly in the middle. I can understand, and all my colleagues as me, we can understand both the languages, both the needs. I understand the uncertainties. I understand that the politicians want to know yes or not. I can translate in the two ways. So it's not from science to politics, but it's also the needs from politics to science. And this is in a virtuous way, this is something that works well. Of course, there are also some, the other side of the moon in this system, of course. But this could be a way to address the problem. So I think that including science formally in the activities related to the whole risk cycle, in promoting the multi-risk approach, including also social sciences, and having people who's able to understand all the fields and make the connection could be a suggestion that could be useful also at the European level.
That does sound like you're describing, at least it seems to me as a non-expert, see what the other experts think, describing quite a mature and well-developed system, right? With scientists integrated into it permanently and multidisciplinary as well, you mentioned, right? Involving all the disciplines, and also addressing prevention as well as emergency response. But that means, I'm afraid, I do want to ask you about the dark side of the moon. I want to know if it works. So I don't know about Italy, but I have spoken to somebody who was telling me about the system in France and said, similarly in France, we had, in theory, quite a mature, intricate system of the kind you described. But when COVID hit, for political reasons, the president was like, okay, we need a new advisor, we need a new council, and kind of created a new body, and indeed kept creating new bodies in response to public opinion throughout the COVID pandemic, right? I wonder whether all this set up in Italy, how well does it actually perform during a crisis in your experience?
The COVID was a problem also in Italy, of course, because in the civil protection system that it's mature, well structured, we usually deal with natural risks and some kind of anthropogenic risks for us, industrial hazards, like things like that. COVID was among the risks in charge of the Ministry of Health. So they built up a new commission, scientific commission. We have already our major risk commission that doesn't include, now it includes also the health, but it didn't at the time. Mm-hmm. So this was a problem. So the point is why this the spectrum of the interest of the activities of civil protection? And this is a question also for Europe, because DG ECHO is working on this, because after COVID, we were strongly involved in COVID. We have been also strongly involved in Ukraine crisis, because we supported the civil part of the people coming in Italy from Ukraine. And now we are have been involved in the Libya emergency, floods, plus dam, plus a lot of vulnerability, plus difficult from the political point of view. So civil protection is widening. And if you talk with the Swedish people, they consider crisis and work together. So which is the boundary in which we have to talk about emergencies, about crisis, and about risks? This is a high-level discussion, I think, that should be that is in fact addressed by the Commission and by the Europe as well.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you all very much. So, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, both at home, online, and in the room, I don't believe we have a roving microphone, but that's okay. I see. I thought we do have a roving microphone. Excellent. Okay, so if you're in the room and you would like to make a comment or question, then the microphone will come to you. Just wave. You can also, and also if you are at home, you can ask a question by typing it into Slido. So it's Slido, slido.com, and then it's #S4P conference, as in Science for Policy Conference. If you're in the room, you can also type it there if you're shy, and it should appear on the screen in front of me, and so we can pass on the questions to the panel. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, hello everybody. Elias from the Joint Research Center. And I have a question regarding the type of risks that we currently consider in risk registries and also in the debate right now. Often they're about sort of risk related to nature and nature degradation, climate change as an amplifier. My bedtime framework update, great reading. And there they talk also more about existential risks stemming directly from technological change. So from artificial intelligence, beyond the type of human rights framing that we currently have, from engineered pandemics rather than naturally occurring pandemics. And I'm wondering whether you think that there currently is a bias towards these more, let's say, natural risks and an underrepresentations of these new type of risks. Thank you.
Who would like to comment on those?
I just, when you were talking, I remembered we had a session with an expert, and there was an economist who said that the worst enemy of a crisis manager is a lack of imagination. I think it's always like that. We're really, with a crisis really hit, we are kind of, puzzled to where did it come from. I think also that we are underestimating the possible technological risks, which is it's kind of a crisis that never has been before with a technology which we're still not using or which is just emerging. Hence, we can't have an experience with a crisis like that. And it's very hard to prevent that for exactly that reason. So I think we are actually underestimating the risks from technology. As myself, having a background in computer science and knowing how this algorithm works, I think it's probably not very likely. But at the same time, unlikely things happen all the time, right? This is the thing with crisis, isn't it? Yeah.
But it's all very well to say, like, okay, prepare for the risks you can imagine, prepare for the risks that you have seen already in the past. But how can you possibly prepare for a risk that you cannot even imagine yet?
Yeah, I think this is one of the best outcomes of the report of crisis management as a work of Tina, that all crises have something in common. So maybe it sounds too sciencey, but we are dealing with a crisis, a general abstract crisis, which still has the same common features. So we can learn from completely different crises for the new one. For exactly that reason.
I saw Tina and Barbara both reach for the microphones. Tina and then Barbara.
Yeah, I think so. One of the first things is, of course, that what we just said on a relatively abstract level, that a crisis always exploits a vulnerability in the system that exists. So it doesn't turn into a crisis if there is no vulnerability, right? And if there's no exposure as well. So what you would try to do is, while you, of course, monitor the risks that you know that should be monitored, of course, everything else would be stupid. If you have a volcano that is starting to move, then please monitor that, right? But for the rest, think about sort of how can you improve societal resilience? How can you reduce vulnerabilities? And what would be essential also coping mechanisms that you would strengthen, sort of what Maarja just said, no matter what happens, right? People will always need other people. They will need food, they will need clean water, they will need shelter, they will need education, right? That's what you can prepare for in any case, and then plus then the question of how do we want to live? That's then very handing over to Barbara, of course, that you have to. So I was about a year ago in DC at a panel of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, where it was about, how could we survive a nuclear winter? When I came out of that session, I said, I don't know if I would want to survive a nuclear winter. No, but really because you would live in such dire conditions with the majority of humanity wiped out in complete darkness, cold, and from some kind of microgreens, that you really have to, and it's not that I don't like microgreens, but it's also this complete societal upheaval that would imply. You would, Stone Ages, I don't know, you would be back to a society that has nothing to do with our culture, with our values, with our norms, that you really would have to ask yourself, would that be desirable in any case? So I think that question also plays a big role, especially in these technological risks that you were referring to.
I think we need to interject and say that risks are not objectively measurable entities that are just out there and that we then go out and measure. So we as societies, we classify. We build the category of what a risk is. So to give a very practical example, there was no risk of domestic violence before there was a concept of domestic violence. So when it was okay for husbands to hit their wives, and sometimes also the other way, there wasn't a risk for domestic violence. Think of sexualized harassment, racialized violence, and so on. So we have historically a tendency to see risks better when we consider them as coming from the outside and from the inside. So I can't give a good answer to your question, but I would say that there is certainly there's something certainly that I observe as well, that there's an increasing awareness of phenomena and practices that we engage in also causing some risks that we need to consider as relevant, the risk of poverty, the risk of violence, and so on and so on. So you find it in the SDGs, you find it in other policies. But whenever there are risks that are marginalized, we also need to think of, or some practices that are not considered risk, we always need to think of what function does that fulfill, that this is not considered a risk. So this is a plea to not take risk as a sort of hard category, but always see how we actually create the notion of risk in our societies.
Interesting. We have a question online aimed specifically at Daniela. Could you make reference to a successful science-informed policymaking example in civil protection in Italy? So an example of a time when it's worked well.
Oh, yes. Of course, after an emergency. After an earthquake occurred in Italy in 2009, a law was issued in which we started a plan for prevention of the seismic risk. We decided to start this plan at national level, distributing funds to all the regions involved in high risk level, seismic risk level. And the way in which we distributed funds to reduce the vulnerability of buildings, public, private, and infrastructure, was related to the study of seismic hazard, seismic risk carried out by our scientific community. So we decided to distribute funds to reduce the risk based on the knowledge that our scientific community provide us with related to the level of hazard and the level of risk in each region. So this is a way in which we made a decision based on science. And if I may add very quickly something to the question, we work with the scientists who provide us information that deal with the applied science. But for the future risks, for the technological risks that we cannot imagine, I think that there is a wide room in the research of basic research science, so not applied, pure science. I think that the Horizon, for instance, the Horizon project could explore very deeply this kind of future perspectives, because we are involved in science related to volcanoes and to power plants or to floods, but to explore these new perspectives, basic science, base science, I don't know how the pure science could be the place where to explore it.
Very good, thank you. See, Chloe? Yeah. Okay, sure, you already have it. Okay, yeah, and then Chloe.
Thank you. My name is Ieva. I'm a policy researcher from Vilnius, PPMI. I was really fascinated about this notion of values and how a value conflict or a value conflict that we didn't even realize existed really comes to light during crisis. And I was wondering, how can we better, are there any practical ways to really approach a value conflict? I mean, I do understand these broad notions of making the society more open to evidence and so forth, but on a ground level, as policymakers or as researchers, how do we navigate a value conflicts in a way that's constructive and brings about positive outcomes for democracy?
So if I may,
yes.
There's no. This is a very, very important. Well, it should be something. That's my whole point. It should be a question for everyone. See that the problem, the fact that I'm seen as the expert now is part of the problem.
Sorry.
But I think it's a hugely difficult and important question, and there's no answer that fits all scenarios. But one thing that is always part of a solution is to make those values explicit. And the European Group on Ethics, we said this in our statement on values in times of crisis, that especially when there's time pressure, then it's very understandable that sometimes policymakers think we don't have time for values, we have to solve the problem at hand. I get that. But as soon as you rely on people's willingness to adhere to the measures, then it's very, very important to make explicit the values that underpin certain decisions, certain options, and also certain instruments. And it can be, I see that you're skeptical because it can be difficult, but just spelling it out for yourself as a policymaker. What am I now going for the value of personal freedom to move freely, or am I going for the value of protecting life? Just by making this explicit can help you frame the question at hand in a different way. So that always needs to be part of the story. And then there are different solutions. Sometimes you can afford time-wise to have a public deliberation, or you have experts who help you, or sometimes it needs to be a technocratic decision. So the pathways from that point on are different, but you need this first reflection on what are the values that certain policy options. Yeah.
Sorry.
What happens then if, because very widely different policy solutions can be suggested for the same value, for instance, personal freedom. We can have policy solutions that are argued for in a way that's ridiculous to some who still subscribe to personal freedom. Some people, I mean, I don't want to. Okay, I don't
then
want
you
to.
can one sentence, sorry, Tina. Then you can either say we have a public debate about this,
Yes.
or you say I have to make a decision quickly and I'm going for A. And most policymakers shy away from this because they think they're making themselves vulnerable. In the short term, yes. In the middle run, no. Sorry, Tina. You too.
No, just also trying to be very concrete here, right? So I work at technical university. We do a lot of models, simulation models, about potential outcomes of policy decisions or of specific scenarios, for instance, in COVID, right? And then what we try to do is not just say, oh, this was for policy A, this is going to be the number of hospitalized people, and this is for policy B, the number of hospitalized people and how it evolves over time, but also integrate other implications in the model, right? So you can have economic implications, and of course, yes, there's uncertainty associated to them. You can have something like school closures and kids not able to attend school anymore, to make the trade-offs that you're facing also explicit. But that for us meant that we were asked, by policymakers, what should we do locally? And we say, well, that's not my role. Sorry, I can't tell you exactly what you should do, but I can show you that the outcomes of your decision, on these and these objectives, as we then call them, not directly valued, are, this and this. And then there is a trade-off, which then requires a deliberation process. But what we can do is, A, be very transparent about how we get to these trade-offs, try to help people reason through them to make these trade-offs and really get a better grasp of the implications of their decisions, to avoid that it's all just about hospitals being full or not being full, right? Also compare different timelines. And then third, also help them to have something more concrete to think about and to argue about and to reason with than very abstract norms that may also be very hard to communicate.
Great, thank you. We are up against the clock, so Chloe, in a moment you may ask what will be the final question of the day. I just want to give the panel a heads up that, so our friend Shira here has kindly volunteered this afternoon in the final plenary session to bring the outcomes of this discussion to the plenary. So panelists, if you could think also before the end of the session, one highlight, so nothing new, but something that's already been said by yourself or by another panelist, that you think is an important takeaway from this session. You could perhaps mention it and Shira will jot it down and bring it forward. Yeah, Chloe, go ahead and ask us the last question.
All right, pressure. I also just wanted to mention the JRC's recent report on values and identities, a policymaker's guide, because that basically answers that exactly. I can share it with you after. It's amazing. Yeah. Oh, you are? Okay, yeah, super interesting. But actually, this is a broader question to finish, I guess. So this particular topic on crisis and vulnerability, it seems like a very, very interdisciplinary topic that brings together natural sciences and social sciences. And that for me is really, really interesting because it seems like, from what I've heard so far and some positive examples, it's been done quite successfully. And I still see a lot of other areas really struggling to bring the social sciences together with the natural sciences. So maybe if there's any lessons you've learnt on bridging that gap. To anyone in the panel.
Great. Who was it? You may, please do.
Very quickly, this joins also with the use, if you allow me, of the Horizon projects. And for me, here we are in Science for Policy. I think that one thing that it's important is to build the requests that are in the calls of Horizon together with the end users. For me, about civil protection, but all in other fields, because I participated in a Horizon project in which I was in the advisory board, but we wrote the proposal together since the beginning. And part of this proposal was about the quality of life of people that were displaced after an emergency, living in temporary housing. So there was an earthquake, 3 earthquakes indeed. There was a part of social science because we interviewed these people that was living. And the outcome was about how, as civil protection, we could make better in future crises, in future emergencies, to make these people have a higher quality of life during the emergency. So this is a way, one of possible infinite ways to put together in a constructive way our activities all together, I think. I don't know if I answered you, but this is an example.
While you have the microphone, Daniela, what would be your one takeaway from this session that you think we should report back to the whole conference?
For me, the most important thing is that we do not have to imagine a one-way process from science to policymakers and to activities or action to be taken. I think since the beginning we should work together, keeping separated responsibilities, because scientists have their own responsibilities that are not related to the decisions. This has to be clear, otherwise the mix will be, of course, science will influence policies, but it's not up to the scientists to take this kind of responsibilities. Each of us has our responsibilities, but work together with common goals, build together activities, not in one way, not in two way, but together.
Thank you very much. Let's go back along the line this way then. So Maarja, any final words, tips for Shira?
When it comes to science for policy, we a little bit touched implicitly on a topic of trust. But I liked most of all from Tina's work and other experts that trust is not something that just is or is not, but just trust is something that can be worked on. So even engineered, maybe it's like a negative connotation, but you can actually work building trust. And actually I liked reflecting upon that even if you just, did something that trust will erode, you can still build it back. Okay, if you do it like 10 times in a row, maybe then not, but once you still can do it. So I'd really like to take that idea with you that trust just isn't. Trust can be managed.
Thank you. Barbara?
But I would then also say that can be quite dangerous. Huh? I'm thinking of Runciman's warning that democracies in the 21st century will die by us still trusting them when they no longer function. So trust without practice that deserves the trust can be quite dangerous. But my takeaway for Shira, I thought Shira's your note-taking was enthusiasm about what we say. So I think my takeaway, which really was illustrated here, is that questions of evidence and scientific evidence are always also relevant for thinking about values and ethics, and questions of value and ethics are always part of science in the narrow sense of the word, scientific science advice for policy making. So I think it is clear that they cannot be separated categorically, and I think we would do better science advice if we accommodated those interconnections rather than pretending that they're not there.
Thank you. And Tina?
Thanks. So I just also wanted to reflect on that, also in the notion of trust. I think for me, also reflecting back on the experience of chairing the working group and writing an evidence review report, what has been very important to us is the integrity of the process. So meaning that we are not just like any football trainer having opinions about crisis response or COVID response, but that we follow the scientific method and that we have a rigorous approach that can be, you know, that other people could follow and arrive at the same result, that we have something that is that you can check and so forth. I think that is really, really important and is central also to policy advice, to communicate very clearly, this is the process, this is the evidence that we arrived at, and then based on this, of course, you know, it's advice, so you have to have an interpretation of it and so forth, but make very clear, this is the evidence or this is the research, doesn't matter which field you are, but sticking to the scientific method and then following it, because I think that also will then allow others to build trust and to be different from all the voices that policymakers are confronted with, and that's especially important in the heat of a crisis, also to transport that and convey that to a policymaker, even though this is not what they may want to hear. So staying true to the science, and for us also keeping our independence, was really essential.
Wise words to finish. Thank you very much indeed.